Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen Evans, Executive Director of FotoFest, and welcome to today's edition of Creative Conversations Digital, our program that was created in the aftermath of COVID. Well, not the aftermath, we're still in it, but because of COVID-19, but something that we're going to continue because we've had great success with it, and we appreciate everybody that's signed on to watch the conversations. It's taught us a lot about our international audience, and we appreciate everyone attending. I'll just do some housekeeping as we get started. FotoFest owes a great debt of gratitude to all of our supporters, and in particular, our major institutional and individual supporters, which include the Houston Endowment, the Brown Foundation, Inc., the National Endowment for the Arts, the Texas Commission on the Arts, the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance, the Philip and Edith Leonian Foundation, the Powell Foundation, the Wortham Foundation, David and Martha Moore, the WWW Foundation, Nina and Michael Zilka, the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in the United States, and lastly, but certainly not leastly, the FotoFest Board of Directors. As well, we'd like to thank the supporters of our annual fund that sustain us year to year. We really appreciate all of your support. I want to thank the staff too, especially in particular because this program has to do with our portfolio review, the Meeting Place Portfolio Review for Artists, which is within the industry is one of FotoFest's best known programs, but to the wide public, perhaps a little bit lesser known because mostly it takes place at the host hotel for the FotoFest Biennial. But our incredible staff, Marta Sanchez Felipe and Sarah Ansel, do an amazing job with that program. They also have a range of volunteers that give great support to that program. And I'm personally very appreciative of them. I also want to thank Max Fields, our Associate Curator and Director of Publishing, who is coordinating these talks, and Vinod Hobson, our Director of Communications, who helps to coordinate these talks and gets the word out to everybody. In addition, I wanted to thank some supporters of the Meeting Place Portfolio Review, the Whitehall Houston Hotel, the Foundation for a Civil Society, the Wing Foundation, and the Institut d'Etudes Baleariques, and as well our media partner this past year, Art Houston Magazine. This particular talk comes out of the Meeting Place, but also another program that is generated by the Meeting Place called 10 by 10. It used to be called Discoveries of the Meeting Place. And it's where FotoFest will ask our esteemed curators, gallerists, editors, participants that are reviewers at the Meeting Place to pick their most significant body of work that they saw in the past Meeting Place. And so this year, we had 10 artists represented that were chosen by 10 different curators, and it was quite a strong show. And although the biennial was only open for 10 days because of COVID-19, we have kept most of the work, and we will be representing the exhibition at some point in the future. In this case, we're highlighting the work of Yan Wang Preston, who was chosen by Matthew Kluk. And Yan Wang Preston is a British Chinese artist. She's interested in the contested conditions of nature within contemporary societies. Her major projects include Mother River and Forest. Mother River was 2010 to 2014, Forest 2010 to 2017. And Preston's work has won numerous international awards, including the first prize in the professional landscape category Sony World Photography Awards in 2019, 100 Heroines, the Royal Photographic Society in 2018, first prize Syngenta Photography Award in 2017, and the Shiseido Photographer Prize at the Three Shadows Photography Annual Award in Beijing, China in 2016. Solo exhibitions of Preston's work have been presented at venues such as the 56th Venice Biennale, the Three Gorges Museum and the Wuhan Art Museum in China, the Gallery of Photography Ireland in Dublin, and Impressions Gallery in Bradford, UK. Preston was one of the featured artists, as I mentioned just a moment ago, of 10 by 10 at the FotoFest Biennial 2020. Her monographs, Forest and Mother River, were both published by Hache Kantz in 2018, and her work is featured or has been featured in numerous publications, magazines, newspapers such as The Guardian, Irish Times, European Photography, British Journal of Photography, Chinese Photography. Her work is collected by institutions as well as private collectors worldwide. She was originally trained in clinical medicine in China and was awarded a doctorate in photography from the University of Plymouth in the UK in 2018. In addition to her artistic practice, she lectures at the University of Huddersfield, UK. Matthew Kluk, the reviewer that chose Yan Wang Preston's work that we presented this past year, is a doctoral student in the history of art and architecture at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. He specializes in the history and theory of photography with particular research interest in 19th century visual culture, museums and exhibiting, and conceptual approaches to the medium of photography. Before going to study at Brown, he worked as a curatorial assistant in the photography department at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art from 2015 to 2019, focusing on the development and exhibition of the permanent collection. He contributes substantially to numerous exhibitions there and has also held positions at the J. Paul Getty Museum, the Clark Art Institute, and the Art Institute of Chicago. He holds an MA from the graduate program in the history of art at Williams College, Williamstown, Mass., and a BA from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And then lastly, at the end of the program, we'll be taking questions. So we encourage dialogue and engagement from the audience. If you've got a question and you're participating on YouTube, you can send it to us through the chat or through the Q&A field. And those will be presented by Max Fields, who will follow up after a presentation by Yan Wang Preston and a conversation between Yan Wang Preston and Matthew Kluk. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it, and it should be a great afternoon. Yan, it's your cue.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, Stephen, for the introduction, and actually for really inviting me here, because I was really looking forward to be at FotoFest this year. It's obviously a pity that I couldn't be there. So now I think, particularly under this kind of situation, opportunities like this are really important. So thank you for that. Matthew and I will mainly be talking about my forest project, which was part of the 10 by 10 exhibition. But I thought I'll just introduce my work a little bit more, the overall context, so the audiences will know a bit more about my work. So I will start the slideshow, shall I? Okay, I'll share my screen. A moment. Okay, so share screen. What am I doing here? One moment. I'll stop share and share again. Share screen. Okay, here we go. Okay, can you see this screen of the slideshow?
Yes.
Okay, I'll
Looks
stop.
good.
Yeah. Okay, so I consider my career really started only 10 years ago in 2010. And since then, I've only done 2 long-term projects. One's called Mother River, one's called Forest. So that's why we have the title of the presentation, Rivers, Trees, and the Flowers. And that part will be just a tiny bit of what I'm developing at the moment. So just to give you a taste of what Mother River project was, because really that was my first major project, I have a very short film here. Okay. In 2010, I decided to embark on the hardest adventure of my life, to photograph the entire 6,211 kilometer Yangtze River in China. I set myself a challenge to photograph every 100 kilometers. Is there something wrong? A moment. Stop share. Can you see that screen now?
Yan, we can see a screen, but it is blank. It is black. Okay.
In
yes.
2010, I decided to embark on the hardest adventure of my life, to photograph the entire 6,211 kilometer Yangtze River in China. I set myself a challenge to photograph every 100 kilometers. 63 predetermined waypoints from the river source at 5,400 meters above the sea level on the Tibetan Plateau to the river mouth in Shanghai. I had no idea what I was going to photograph or whether I was even going to make it to the end. After 8 trips, 1,200 sheets of films, in the temperature range of -30 to +44 degrees, I finally stood with my feet in the sea. I want you to join me on this journey. Just need to make sure the light is. Yangtze as a mother river of China is represented by grand images of very few special locations. I wanted to challenge this by photographing all of the river with its wilderness, its abundant beauty, its everyday people and places. So that film was actually made for my Kickstarter campaign 2 years ago, when I raised money for publishing the Mother River book. And to follow up from that last sentence in the film, Yangtze as a mother river of China is represented by beautiful images of very few locations. So that's actually a discovery I made through the research and development process of this project. I discovered that the mother river, as we know of, we meaning a native Chinese person, really is mythic. It only exists in representations. You know, for example, the mother river that every Chinese person knows looks like the back of this 10 yuan Chinese currency. That's a picture of one of the 3 gorges on the Yangtze River. And obviously now it's still there, but the water level will be a lot higher because of the 3 Gorges Dam. And in a way, you might think that this is only for the Chinese, that we think it's a mother river, but actually in the popular visual culture, the Yangtze River, it doesn't matter if it's in China or if it's outside of China, it's mostly known as 2 things. One is a natural beauty, the national icon for China. For example, you put Yangtze River in Google, these are the pictures you get. And these are the views you might expect to see if you take on a Yangtze River cruise. Again, most of them are of the 3 gorges. And obviously, because of all the dams, they were built on the Yangtze River, particularly the Three Gorges Dam, we also knew it as the environmental victim of China. But it took me about 2 years between 2010 and 2012 to to work out what the Yangtze really was to me personally and publicly, and also how I needed way to penetrate through the very saturated visual representation of the Yangtze River. And obviously I went to many locations on the river. I took a lot of pictures, but what I found very, very powerful was this set of crazy performances I did on different river locations. They were connected with one character, which was that tactile engagement with the river, which is, if you say it's my research subject matter, normally you don't get that close to your research or your photographic target. But this time, in this picture, I was touching the frozen headwater. One of the frozen headwaters of the Yangtze River, and this is quite high up. It's about 5,340 meters above the sea level. You can see at the background, that's one of the source glaciers. It's in a very remote corner on the Tibetan plateau. And I made a red circle. I think at the time I was still very attached to this kind of mythic harmony between nature and culture. We believe that in traditional China we had that, but later I discovered actually that's also mythic. And this is one of the details of the red circle. So, and then did another performance, which was to carve 127 stones by a small Yangtze tributary before placing them into this river. I think you can see that the landscape at this location is radically different from the first one. The first one was almost pristine wilderness. It's beautiful and grand. It's very fitting for being the mother river source. But this one is like the middle of nowhere. No one even bothered to stop their car to look at what I was doing. I think it's quite interesting with the first performance. It was kind of painfully real and comforting that, the mother river was still there. I touched it. But with this performance, my body was literally screaming in pain. For a week, I sat on a little stool to carve these stones. So with that pain, my body was making me thinking about different questions, i.e., I have been traveling up and down this river for 2 years now. I have not found that kind of mother river picture, mother river landscape on any of the real locations. What's happening here? Is it because those are only pictures? Is it because Mother River is not real? It doesn't really exist in a physical sense. So I think it's a thinking with the body when I was doing this kind of performances that made me ask these really crucial questions. And finally, I, did the ultimate thing you do with rivers. So in Chongqing, it's one of the major cities along the river. I actually went swimming in the river, and this was one of the most powerful experiences in my life, I think. Through swimming, I realized the river was not dead, because the water was really powerful and scary, very much alive. But also, while in the river, I was observing the city landscape, which I originally found overwhelmingly intense. But if you think of the river even symbolically as the embodiment of history, because the river has always been there and the river's always flowing, and the river, the city landscape all of a sudden looked quite transient. So this made me think that actually the current era of China is not the end of China's history, it's simply part of it. So this had a direct impact on how I might photograph the river later. For example, I would not photograph it in a very conflict with, between, that kind of sublime landscape where there's a lot of binary between human and the built environment. I thought actually I would step back a little bit more and produce a more balanced view. So after 2 years doing all sorts of research and experiment on the river, and through literature review, through social interaction, I decided, okay, now I understand that mother river that I knew as a native Chinese person, that I knew of, was mythic. And its photographic representation had some characters. One of the characters is it has this kind of regional hierarchy, i.e. only a few locations have always been photographed, such as the Three Gorges and the Three Gorges Dam. And another one is most of the photographs, if they are celebrating the river, they have this kind of really postcard-like idealistic aesthetic, or they have this very overwhelming environmental perspective that river is a victim. So there's kind of nothing in between. So I thought, maybe I could do something that has not been done to the river. For example, I could photograph the entire river. That's it's easily said because it's 6,211 kilometers long. And also through equal distance. And it's not really, the emphasis is not on every 50 or every 100 kilometers, but on every. So I'm conceptually trying to challenge that set hierarchy between river locations, i.e. this is more fitting for the mother river and that's not. In my system, all the locations are equally important. And also I was hoping that through this system, I would get a set of vernacular landscapes that are not normally associated with the mother river. So these are the this one's a Google Earth map where I divided the river into 62 equal sections. And with this, I got a set of GPS numbers. My task was to find these GPS coordinates in real life as precisely as possible and photograph them. So obviously we don't have time to get into the details on how then the project was done. I can say that it's done with dust, sweat, tears, and occasional blood. It was my first major project. It was physically very challenging. I gave it everything I had, really. And here is a very short film just to show a little bit of the process.
这么凉啊！哇，绝对冰镇啤酒。This is the most expensive bed I've ever slept on. 150,000 pounds. What do you think about that? And sleeping bag from my best friend. So warm. Hey.
So that was our morning exercise. I think that was at Y6. So I think the resulting photographs from the Mother River project really traced the development from kind of a pristine wilderness all the way to this modern metropolis. So, the river source here, Y1, is in the middle of nowhere on the Tibetan plateau. Y2 still looking pristine. I say pristine, but in fact it's not, there's no pristine wilderness anyway. And this area is inhabited by people and obviously by a lot of wild animals. But, in this November condition, you don't see all those things. Y13, it does look like a Noah's Ark, but actually these people are stealing wood, timber from that primeval forest on the right-hand side of the river. And I did say that I wanted to produce some multi-layered stories along the river, but also the vernacular scenes. And I think this photograph at Y21 demonstrates that. At Y25, this location is now underwater. It's been flooded in 2013 in June, I think, by one of the over 33 Yangtze River dams. Y40, Y54. Again, you can check on my website or in my book for the picture sequences all there. But just this is the river mouth. I can tell you that this is one of the most profound moments in my life to reach the mouth of the Yangtze River after seeing all of it. Couple of other things, when I said it's blood, sweat, dust. The project, for me, I think, first of all, is quite conceptual, but it's also built on the documentary tradition of photography. But also, it's very physically challenging. So, things happened on the way. For example, at Y15 and 16, I could not find the white points. Particularly at Y16, it's a big struggle. I was attacked by a Tibetan dog. I ended up having to inject myself 5 times. My medical training was useful in this instant. And I ended up having actually 2 blank pictures in the sequence. It was very hard to make that decision at the time, but I think looking back now, it seemed to have made the project more interesting. And at Y42, actually quite a few white points, I loaded the film back to front by mistake. It took me quite a few months to actually recover and reshoot. But again, I decided to include 2 of these pictures in the sequence just to indicate the physicality of the project, but also to undermine my own pretended documentary authority. So this is the final book. And now we very quickly go into Forest Project. Forest Project was actually developed alongside Mother River. I think the 2 projects, went ahead parallelly, and sometimes one was more intense and sometimes the other one was more intense. So in 2011, I did a residency in Chongqing. It's my Y38 out of Y63 white points on the river. So it's bang on in the middle. I noticed something very strange. These oak trees, they were wrapped up in gigantic plastic bags. They're looking very sad, propped up by supporting systems, and they had nutrition bags stabbed into their bark. For me, they looked more like, bleeding soldiers struggling to stand up on a battlefield, more like that than a woodland. What's happening here? And also, most of the time you see them at empty building sites. The 2 things, that the old trees and the new buildings, they just don't add up. I very quickly realized that Chongqing at the time had a policy of building itself into a forest city. So, but obviously concrete forest grows a lot faster than trees. So the city decided to buy mature trees and transplant them instead of growing saplings. And that's why you see this. I very quickly realized there were a lot of questions to ask here, i.e. whose trees were they? What happened to their homeland? Who's making money? It's obviously a big business. With whose money? And what will the trees survive? And what would the city become? So I think I was really interested in the politics of this city greening project. And but how to go forward? I felt like it was not very difficult to keep producing these kind of empty, very sad, bleak pictures. But I felt the project needed more. So I think one method I decided to do was to simply follow the development of certain sites and trees, to do repeat photography. Every so often I'd revisited a tree or woodland to see how they were growing. And within this tree, Frank really told me quite a lot of the complexity of the situation. I came across Frank by accident at Y25 when I was actually shooting Mother River. You can see, it's a magnificent tree. It's really the center of the village life, but the village was half demolished. You can see the red slogan in the picture. It says, if you move earlier, you get stabilized earlier, you benefit earlier, and you get rich earlier. So it's obviously a propaganda slogan to persuade villagers to move, because it was going to be flooded very soon by a Yangtze River Dam. And this was in March 2013. In June 2013, I went back to the same village and everything was gone. There was nothing left. I stayed around for a few days. Finally, some villagers told me, oh, this tree was sold to a nearby city, and it was sold to the owner of a 5-star hotel and the star wasn't built yet. So we found the tree in this state. I can tell you it was heartbreaking to see it from its original state. And apparently 4 very old trees in the city were sold together for about $12,000. And every family had a share. So they did see this as, public property. And 4 years later, I went back to the same site. And this is how I found it. Frank had died 2 years before my visit. So, this really made me think, what is happening here? Is it about the trees? Is the project about trees, or is it actually about people? And so I think I'm just going to tell you another site, and then Matthew and I will start, actually having a conversation. Another site I visited was this Yan area in Chongqing. Again, I photographed this 5 times. This was in March 2011, and you can see everything was still being built. And a year later, underneath the huge bridge, and it was all built up, everything was brought in, all the trees. And in 2014, this is still under the bridge. They planted this old tree here, but it was always fairly empty. And 2017, so this was 6 years after the first picture was taken, slightly off the center from the last picture, but everything was built up. And under the same bridge, you can still see these old trees. I think this picture was a turning point. I realized, maybe the city and the people and the trees can grow together. It can become a homeland. So I think this is something I did not expect at the beginning of the project. It really, organically grow into this. So I'll stop here and let's bring Matthew in. I'll stop share my screen.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Thanks for having me. Yan, I kind of just wanted to start off by asking, you spoke a little bit about what drew you to the city of Chongqing along the way of you kind of completing your Mother River project. But I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what drew you specifically to that city. I mean, was there something sort of unique in the way that it was laid out or being built, or did you kind of see it as representative of a sort of building program that was going on in China?
I think to start with, I saw the tree transplanting business going on all over China. You know, you can believe me because I traveled the whole width of it. So in a way, I could have photographed the trees everywhere, and I did a little bit. But I think at the time, you know, Mother River was such an overreaching project. Sometimes I felt I was kind of the victim of my own system. I could not really get into depths of particular locations. So with forest, I wanted to go other way, in a way that I didn't want to go this really macro scale project. I wanted to go into the depths of things and concentrate on one place, perhaps. And so Chongqing, under this kind of consideration, Chongqing seemed to be very suitable. First of all, Chongqing was China's fourth municipal city. It was, a very young municipal city. So it was going through some really intense urban renewal and urban expansion. In that way, it provided a lot of materials for me. I think you probably know a lot of photographers have worked in Chongqing. Chongqing really is a sweet shop for photographers because the structure of the city is very 3D. It has two major rivers and a lot of mountains. It's a very hilly city. Sometimes with landscape photography, we need height. And you have that in Chongqing. And it's bang on in the middle. I could often visit it. And so that's why I decided, everything considered, Chongqing is perfect place to go into depths of this project.
And I know I looked it up and it's like mind-blowing to me that they have something like 30 million inhabitants in the entire region. So, I mean, just with a city of that scale, and especially knowing that you were there only for a limited time, each time that you were there, I mean, outside of the residency at least, how did you go about picking the sites within the city? Were you kind of talking to locals to get a sense of where to gravitate, or was this just sort of alone going out into the city environment and seeing what spoke to you?
Okay. I actually very quickly realized I was only interested in the new sites. Obviously I was walking a lot in the city. I am Chinese, so I blend in very easily. I have constant conversations with people. The old towns of Chongqing, you still have old town areas, but they were not telling me the same things. So I was mostly interested in the politics, in the ideology behind this greening, project, or the idea of greening cities. So with that in mind, new cities, I then had types of places, i.e., shopping centers. New shopping centers are always a very good area, a type of area, and I had a new property developments. Yeah, once I even pretended that I was interested in buying a property. So I wanted, because I wanted to see the inside, and I paid particular attention to entertainment areas. A bit like Disneyland, but not as grand. Other than that, new public areas, squares, and also the areas that might give you a 3D structure, i.e. Chongqing has many bridges because of its many rivers. So I would have a map, I circle my target areas according to these kind of criteria, and then I'd take the bus because bus is really cheap and you can see a lot on the way because it's very slow. So I take a bus to my destination, I walk about. So that's how I, went about it. This one area, it was fascinating. So I remember I went back there 6 days continuously.
Especially, I'm just curious, I mean, when you're walking around and doing this, especially, pretending to potentially rent an apartment, I mean, did you run into like any major sort of roadblocks or like, problems when you were doing this? I guess I'm just curious, especially for the photographers that are listening into the program today, the sorts of, things you encountered and how you dealt with them.
Yeah. Some people, ask me how does it work access-wise in China. No, I kind of feel access in China is fairly easy. Perhaps because I'm a woman, so I don't come across being threatening. With my large format camera, there's no chance I'm a journalist.
Mm.
So my way of doing it is don't ask. Yes, yeah. I mean, at public areas, generally speaking, it's fine. There are some sensitive buildings. I remember once I was photographing outside of a bank, and the security guard really told me off. Fair enough. And another time, I just followed some people and walked into a gated community. And I already planned out that picture. So I went in, didn't ask anyone, set up my camera, bang, got my shot. And then the security guard came, they completely kicked me out. But generally speaking, I think it's actually quite a lot of freedom.
Okay. I'm just curious because you mentioned like that you already had like a shot in mind, that you sort of went in, you took it, and you knew exactly when to leave and go out. And I mean, something that I find like so powerful and evocative about these photographs every time that I go through them is just like the emptiness and sort of, this like looming, almost sublime city landscape and so few people within it. And of course, people do start to appear throughout the book, but I guess I'm just wondering the degree to which like you consciously made a decision to include or exclude people from the frame, and like, what was your thinking behind that and what weighed on your decision making?
Mm-hmm. I think at the very beginning of the project, you can see the early pictures, they completely didn't have any people in. And I think later, actually, I read a review of the work. I realized that was true in a way. I was photographing these natural beings in a very, very unnatural way. It's so lifeless. And I think at the time I felt the trees were so isolated. Have you read the book, The Life of Trees?
I haven't.
Yeah, so it talks about trees are very social beings. Their roots are joined together. They communicate. But these trees, they don't look like they were communicating. So I think at the beginning it was quite unconscious, like emotional connection with what I saw, and I photographed them all without anyone in. But I think, I just explained with Frank, I realized, oh, you know what? I'm not just interested in trees. I'm actually interested in people, in how we think a good life is. So that kind of realization made me to a step back with my camera. So I gradually took in the wider view, and that included trees, people, and buildings. I think, later pictures of this project, they were just full of people. They became like a, city scene really. And it was a very different way to photograph. It's a lot more complex than photographing static trees. I'll just give you a reference. Let's see maybe this one's a good one. Just one picture, we see the share screen. This one, share.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you can see the trees are still there. They are still supported, but the emphasis, I think, is evenly distributed between people, trees, and the city. Like this one or the next one. So really, I think it's a gradual thing only when I realized the project was also about people.
If you actually want to leave that photo on, that actually I had a question where that would actually be really great to speak to, because when I mean, obviously I've spent a lot of time with this work, and I feel like every time that I keep coming back to it, I get a stronger and stronger sense of these trees really, I mean, like you said, they're almost personified. It's like they're in this, I mean, each scene is so quiet and, often the earlier ones you said kind of desolate, but I don't know, when I read these, I see more of like this tense sort of battle between like humankind and nature and then like the city environment. And, it's like, I almost see them as like very frenetic and sort of almost, like this I don't know, détente in the middle of a larger battle. So I don't know if you wanted to speak to that one, especially the one with the fountain in the foreground with all of those sort of people playing in it. I guess I'm just curious, like what you're hoping that people might take away from this, especially because it speaks to this sort of larger ideology of building up urban centers.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm going to answer your question in a slightly detour way. I did talk this year at Sheffield University in the UK to a group of landscape architects. They were shocked after my talk. They said, we only made a drawing in our design with an oak tree. We didn't mean them to put that in.
Oh gosh.
So what I suppose, I think with this project, again, I see myself as a storyteller. My starting point was obviously this kind of sympathy with trees. And I think a lot of people feel like that. Some of my friends say, oh, why is it that I want to cry when I read this book? So I think if they feel that, then perhaps my intention is achieved on one level in a way that, you know, it does make them to feel something about the trees, and hopefully that means those landscape architects will not put an oak tree in their drawing.
Yeah,
and
not just considering them as part of the background, but actually paying a little bit more attention to them. Okay.
Yeah, and I remember a 7-year-old boy saw that picture, a very early picture of the mango trees standing, you know, with the painted red branches. And he asked his mom that why are the trees bleeding? And she said, because some bad people chopped their arms off.
Huh.
And he said, Mom, I want to chop their arms off. I know it's probably a little bit too violent, but you know,
yeah.
I was there listening to say, wow, interesting. But again, I think different people have, you know, different takes. I was, you know, this, can you see this book? It's called The Botanical City, only published last month. It's actually an academic book about urban nature. And they used a few pictures from this project. It's really interesting to see their pick, because their pick shows that they believe nature is still there. They chose a photograph that were a lot less painful and much more green.
So I want to make sure we have enough time too to get into some of the work you've been doing more recently, because I know you finished the forest project and kind of, you know, fully in 2017. So I guess I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the work you've done since. And of course, since we find ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic, all at home in our respective time zones, if you could just maybe speak a little bit about how your thinking and your process has sort of shifted and adapted in response to, I mean, both the global pandemic and also this sort of renewed dialogue on systemic racism.
Yeah, okay. So I will, I have a few pictures to kind of visually answer this question. I will share my screen again. Okay. You see that picture?
Mm-hmm.
So actually, Forest, the photography finished in December 2017, and I published both Mother River and Forest in 2018. That was quite a big year. And then 2019 was a year to really show the work, mainly Forest. But also, I think I've been developing ideas slowly from where I stopped at Forest. So from Forest, from the questioning towards these kind of ecology, restoration, greening projects, I started paying attention to other ecology restoration projects, first in China. For example, I visited this place in Beijing, actually last year. It's really interesting. These are all quarries. Now, you know, they planted, again, mature trees there. They're bringing nature and wilderness back. I photoshopped that moon in. Can you see that's the photoshopped one?
Oh, yeah.
So really also, playing with the idea, like, how is the pristine nature photographed? Obviously we think of Ansel Adams, which is why I'm playing with this. And so from that, this, guess what this is? It's bear poo.
I was going to say.
And I was in Italy. So last year I also, visited, I did this eco tourism thing to visit a wilderness park to do bear tracking in Italy. And, there was a small fortune spent, a lot of organization and emails, great, deal of wine drunk. We only saw bear poo. And, that made me think, wilderness really is quite far away, and it's being consumed by the few that who can afford it. And obviously I started paying more attention to what's happening in the UK. You can see in this picture, very close to where I live, this is a post-industrial landscape actually. This valley was all just full of little water-powered mills. That was from the 19th century, and now it's been covered by lots of plants. These are mainly beech trees, which are seen as almost invasive species here. It's really interesting. So, one year, last winter, I went with the woodland manager to mark the beech trees that they were going to kill. And it's actually not very difficult to kill a tree, it seemed. I was just really amazed that in China, they were building a forest, but they killed one first. And here we want to have a better forest, so we kill one first. And with all this, I think I was really thinking about, the idea of nature in this kind of era when we are very aware of the climate change, the need of having nature, but what kind of nature? Whose standard is being applied to what? And, and finally, I was thinking about looking really into rewilding as a subject. The coronavirus kicked in, and it became clear that traveling was not very possible, for some time. And I decided that I was still going to look at rewilding, and probably not the kind of very conscious, massive rewilding projects, which are very far away from me. I'd look like this kind of self-seeded semi-wilderness right at my doorstep. And so since the 17th of March, I've been visiting this particular rhododendron bush every other day, but this picture was taken last year. I have a working title. It's called With Love from an Invader. You can see it's a big love heart. And but rhododendron is seen as an invasive species in England. I found this idea of invasive species really interesting, perhaps because I myself, technically I'm an immigrant here. Somehow, it's just slightly uncomfortable. So, it's really interesting to think, why is it seen invasive? And clearly, it's very, very strong, and it's beautiful. And this particular area is really the post-industrial wasteland. So do we want that wasteland, or do we want the flowers?
Yeah, especially being the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, it's like this almost seems like a positive sort of, development.
Yeah, and also, since coronavirus, a lot of problems have resurfaced. For example, in February, March, I don't know about here in the UK, there was a lot of racism against anyone with a Chinese face. I'd feel a little bit nervous going out. Actually, I personally didn't have any problems, but it's, the atmosphere, it was not very healthy. And then it's a Black Lives Matter. So when I was developing this project With Love from an Invader, I had that in mind, but where this will go, I don't know.
I think this might be a good moment to open up to the audience then for some questions, which I think Max is going to field here.
Well, yeah, I do think it's a good time for audience Q&A. Yan, thank you so much for speaking so deeply about your work. And Matthew, your questions were really wonderful. We have a question from audience member Liz Allen, who asks, how does the politics of greening cities connect with the mythologies of nature that you are interested in uncovering in your work? And that's a question for Yan.
Really? Did you say mythology of nature?
Yeah, I guess it's a question around metaphor. She's asking, how does the politics of these cities that are greening, as you say, connect or relate to the mythologies of nature that you come across?
Okay, first of all, I don't really know what you mean by the mythology of nature, but this term is really interesting because, is nature a physical existence or is it a myth? But then we probably want to ask if it's a myth and why is it there? Because if it's a myth, then clearly it has a reason to be there for so long and it's very, very powerful. So I think I've been asking myself, okay, this one side is a policy of greening. Actually, it's a positive thing. We want to have nature in cities. Why do we want to have nature in cities? There is a book called Biofailure by American biologist Wilson. I think his surname is Wilson. He talked about why do we want nature? Is it because at the end of the day, it's our homeland? We found it very beautiful. And I think specifically about forest project, there are a couple of things. First of all, the cities want nature. I think on one side is deep down perhaps is drawn by the need to connect with nature. Even just a trophy of it is still better than living in a pure concrete block with nothing green. And I think ultimately that's the selling point of trees. And with that selling point, then, the business, the capitalists come in. But I think with forest, there is also something quite particular. It's old trees. Old trees fetch more money. And I've been asking myself this, why old trees? And I kind of, my own answer was, and perhaps it's because in a city, in a concrete city that was just built from nothing in a few years' time, we have lost this connection to even a distant memory of a homeland. There's nothing in this new city to remind ourselves of, what we have lost. And these old trees perhaps gave us a little sense of that. And perhaps that's why, we want to pay more, not just for trees, but the older they are, the more expensive they get. So I don't know, I'm really answering your question, but this is what my reflection was on a few points about these trees.
Yeah, I think the question is really interesting. In response to your answer is really interesting, and it makes, because you're covering such a broad amount of concerns and issues through the imagery, through this imagery that could seem very straightforward. We're talking about a relationship between nature and city. And I guess with all of these broad issues being tackled within this, these really specific images, I'm curious to ask you, Matthew, what was your attraction to this work as someone who selected this work for exhibition, for the 10 by 10 exhibition in the 2020 Biennial? What did you see in Yan's work and what that really inspired you to select it? And was there anything specific, any one of these issues that you really were drawn to?
I mean, when I'm looking, especially when I was going through the various portfolios at FotoFest, something I always wanted to look for was like a cohesiveness in a portfolio, something that like, not necessarily that tells like a single narrative or story, but something that can like pull you through from the beginning to the middle and to the end. And like my first take on this work when I saw it was this idea of like, this is the life cycle of a tree in sort of the contemporary Chinese landscape. They start in these sort of rural areas, they're ripped out of the ground, sort of like temporarily preserved or covered to sort of replicate the more, tropical landscape they might be coming from, and then how they sort of then take root in a sort of new city. And it's like they change meaning at each point. So it's like they almost serve as a reminder of this, maybe to connect to the question that was asked about, this sort of idealistic, nostalgic idea of, this like perfect, untouched nature. They almost serve as like talismans in the contemporary landscape in that way. And so that's really something that I appreciated in Yan's work, was that it is very varied and it doesn't ever feel static. This isn't just like a picture of a city in a landscape and a picture of a city in or a tree in a landscape rather. It's like you really do see the different ways in which they're interacted with, both in empty city landscapes with, people in them, and then, just the way they're sort of become just like part of a more cohesive whole and some sort of a tense kind of way. And that's why I keep going back and forth. I had a different reading every time I thought about it. It's like, at one point I thought it was maybe a little bit more of a peaceful coexistence. And then, I saw something a little bit more tense that was maybe about to change. And particularly now, as the entire world has flipped on its head. So I think that's just like, some of the strong qualities in the work that really drew me to it. And especially just the, it's very much of the moment that we're living in right now as well.
I know Stephen Evans has a question if he wants to come in. And then if anyone else from the audience, we have a few more minutes for questions. If you submit your questions in the chat box here, or if you're joining us on Zoom, we'll field them directly to our guests.
Well, one of the things that I've always been impressed by, Yan, since I first saw your work, is its ambition. And I'm sure that was also part of what Matthew responded to. But I wanted to know if you could give us some insight into your thinking about why to begin with such an ambitious project as Mother River when you're throwing yourself into maybe a new field. Could you talk about the genesis of that a little bit more, about how you came to that idea and how you decided to commit yourself to that?
I think I was kind of quite young and fearless at the time. I suppose one reason was after spending 2 years doing the research and experiment on the river, I felt that it was necessary to photograph the whole river in this way in order to get my point across. Because, it's such a gigantic issue, it's such a massive river. You either go for something really iconic and hit it on the head, or you go something with this massive physical scale. It has to have some weight. And I feel that way it does have the weight. And personally, I was a rock climber and mountaineer. So I had been to the headwater areas of the river before. I felt that it was a challenge perhaps I could handle. So physically, the source of the river is somewhere you can be very fit, very wealthy, but it only takes the lack of oxygen to defeat you if you don't know how to deal with it, because it's only got 50% of the oxygen compared with the sea level.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that's, the source was 250 kilometers away from the nearest drivable road. It took us 3 days to get there. It was minus 30 degrees. So I think I have to admit that attraction of an expedition was there as well. But it did take me a long time to commit, because I knew it was something, once I locked myself into it, I had to finish it. I couldn't really, if I just came out halfway, that's completely wasted. So that took some time to persuade myself.
Well, I'm glad you did. It's a remarkable project, but everything that we've seen. Thank you.
We have another question coming from YouTube from Sam Burton. He asks, did you always envisage Mother River as a book? What initiated your research before you even thought of making it into a project?
The first 2 years of Mother River was all over the place, I tell you. I didn't know what I was doing. I kind of followed my nose and my needs until it slowly came into this idea. And when I decided to commit, I call it the white point system. When I decided to commit to that, I always knew it was going to be a book. And we did have many exhibitions, but the exhibitions were kind of almost like the larger version of the book. You know, it had to follow this particular sequence. Yeah, why did I want it to be a book? I suppose I learned so much photography from looking at books, and I just felt naturally that's a good way to present the work in the end.
I guess that's a question for you, Matthew, too, is, I mean, what do you get from a photo book such as Yan's, and how important is, as somebody who's an academic, a scholar, a writer, a curator, you know, what do you get from these, from photo books? Perhaps some of the audience members would enjoy hearing that.
No, and I mean, it's something that I definitely saw, like, and have seen, like, more and more over the last, like, 2 years, that often, like, a photo book now kind of becomes, like, the end point of a project, not necessarily as a physical print, which I'm a little sad about sometimes as, you know, a curator. But I always appreciate the sequencing in a photo book. Like, it's an extra level above, you know, just presenting, you know, making the photographs and making prints and making, you know, maybe a concise set that constitutes the body of work. But to actually, like, make a photo book, it's that different level, you know, it's a different level of sequencing, and you have to think about, you know, what does it mean to see this photo right after another one? You know, is it telling some sort of a narrative? Am I seeing some sort of, like, a visual resonance, you know, between that? So I always appreciate that, because it does give me a little bit of a sort of, you know, quiet insight into an artist's way of thinking about a project. So I always appreciate that, just, you know, from my point of view, like, getting to see, like, how an artist is actually actively thinking about a project. But and I think there's also, you know, like I said, more of a chance for a narrative to sort of be crafted, and not necessarily a story, but, you know, a thread that can kind of pull somebody through that might not be apparent in, you know, just a room that has, you know, a set of photographs displayed. So I don't know. And there is just something to be said for, you know, those sort of quiet contemplative acts of opening and reading a book that is very, you know, it's a one-on-one kind of experience with the body of work, which can be far more intimate.
We only have time for a few more questions, but we have one from Scott Hunter, who asks about the displaced plants in the cities, and asking, does Yan feel that these trees will ever feel a part of a community again, despite the amount of people surrounding them? And this is a question about that relates to that communication between trees that you're speaking about.
First of all, I'm not a tree expert. We can only guess from our human feelings. And it looks to me that the older the trees are, the more difficult it was for them to actually even survive in the city. And some do thrive, actually. Some trees are quite suitable for that city's climate. And as a city tree, they have a lot of light and water for themselves, so they can grow. But I did talk to some tree experts. They say to me that even if these older trees survive initially, the length of their life would be a lot shorter than the natural lifespan. So it's kind of a funny one, because, you know, after a while, these transplanted trees do become just part of the city landscape, and no one seemed to remember their recent past. And I guess if they die, someone else will make more money. Very sad to say that, but it's true.
I think we have time for one last question. Let's make it a 2-minute question. And we'll end this on the 15-minute mark. Please comment about how much you value the beauty of individual photographs compared to the purpose of the overall project. So there's a question of aesthetics, and this is coming from Victor Landweber. Thank you, Victor.
Wow, that's an awesome question. I can tell you, I can confess this. when I was doing forest project as a last trip, during the last trip, I often felt frustrated because part of me wanted to carry on producing fantastically powerful individual pictures. For example, I'll show you this one you have seen. For example, this picture, it was very, very satisfying on the aesthetic level to produce pictures like this. But I think for both of my projects, there is overall narrative, and sometimes this narrative needs other pictures that are not necessarily just, well, hopefully a picture can satisfy different levels, visually beautiful, and also very, very meaningful. But because I think I was locked into this kind of narrative, and often it's not possible to satisfy every goal, and particularly if you don't have all the time in the world. So I think to answer your question, I really do value the aesthetic value of individual pictures. When I was preparing this talk, I revisited this picture, some of these pictures, and wow, I want to carry on. I need to produce some more beautiful pictures, even just for my soul. But again, conceptually, sometimes it doesn't work. So I think the challenge is somehow combine the two things as close as possible.
I think I might also add in too, just like so much of your project, especially working in a documentary mode, is sort of like, highlighting and shining light on something in a massive city landscape like this that might, easily be passed over or avoided or sort of fall into the background. And I mean, a photographic print is like, in my mind, it's kind of an extension of the sort of mission that you went about in this project. It, especially when printed at, I know you do print usually at a larger size for this. So, yeah. I mean, I spoke about the contemplative nature of, being with a photo book. There is also a different sort of experience about being enveloped in a photographic print on a wall that, it enters into the space of the viewer and you can't necessarily just like avoid it. So
that's very true. Yeah, because when I was preparing for the 10 by 10 show, I want to supervise the printing, and wow, the prints were gorgeous. It's not like just praising my own work. I think there's something very satisfying to see a print, a fine print on a very large scale that you don't get that from reading the book. I think the book is probably more about the narrative, the storyline, and on the wall, that's a different level of aesthetic experience.
All of the detail sort of starts to pop.
Well, brilliant. Yan, Matthew, thank you both for joining us for today's Creative Conversation program. Those were really great questions. And thank you to the audience for your brilliant thoughts and responses.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to thank you both, or all three of you actually. Yan, thank you so much for bringing your talent and your work to FotoFest, to the meeting place, and to the 10 by 10 exhibition. Matthew, your thoughts, your discerning eye, and the work you've done for us at the meeting place. Thank you so much, and hope your doctorate's going well. And Max, thanks for setting this all up. It's great. And we will have more Creative Conversations Digital coming up very shortly, an exciting program that will continue through the rest of the summer and then into the fall. So we look forward to seeing you here. And in the meantime, you can go to the YouTube page, FotoFest IMTL, or you can find it through our website. And there we have all of these talks archived, and we also have short films about some of the artists that have been in the Biennial 2020. So please check it out. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great night.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.